I'd just like to give a short welcome first, and then an acknowledgement of country to this fantastic lean-in on such an important topic as novation. And on behalf of the Institute of Architects, I'd like to offer everyone who's attending today a warm welcome. And I believe we've got more than 200 attendees, which is pretty impressive right around Australia. So just fantastic. And it shows the gravity of the issue. My name is Stuart Tanner. I'm the National President, and it's my honour to be your host and moderator for today's Lean-In. And this Lean-In launches our model, Deed of Novation, developed by academic and expert construction lawyer Phillip Greenham, who's one of the panellists today, and with the generous support of Institute member Fender Katslidis, working with a small group of Institute and plan-covered representatives, and Wendy's here today as well. I particularly want to thank Fender Katslidis and their representatives today for this support. Institute members, led by a project of the Victorian Chapter's Large Practice Forum, have been on a very long journey since 2019 to recalibrate novation settings for design and construction procurement. The Deed of Novation and its counterpart, Code of Novation, launched earlier this year, have been informed by evidence base of our research about novated design and construct procurement conducted with Institute members. These tools build on the experience of members in chapters such as in Victoria, where novated D&C has been common for more than 20 years in both government and commercial procurement. In our research, we learned that novation can diminish the original design intent, especially value management during construction delivery phase of a project. And there's risks to principals when architects have actually lost their direct line of communication to them, or, for instance, copies of reports or certificates provided by the consultant to the contractor are not forwarded in their unaltered form to the principal. There are also risks when the architects are not permitted reasonable site access, not invited to project control group meetings, nor participate in the value management processes. So this Deed of Novation helps to address these core issues, which ultimately impact building quality. So before we move on, I do want to give an acknowledgement of country. I'm actually here in the beautiful island of Lutruwita, Palawa and Pakana country, and I'm very privileged and fortunate to have grown up in this beautiful country, camping every summer and wandering the coast and coming across some absolutely incredible Indigenous sites, which are amazingly, some of them are incredibly untouched and very moving. So in recognition of the deep history and culture of our country, we'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners upon the land on which we all gather. I acknowledge that it is a privilege to stand on country and walk in the footsteps of those before us. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and to the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that did not make elder status, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities that continue to care for country. I recognise a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation upon First Nations people. And I stand for a future that profoundly respects, hears, and acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, culture, language, and history. Thank you. Presenters, I'll just run through these. I think if I went through all of the eminent presenters today, accolades would be, the session would be over. So I'll just give a quick summation of each. Phillip Greenham, Principal, JBM Advisory Proprietary Limited. Phillip, thank you for coming along. Phillip has practiced construction law for almost 40 years. He was with the international law firm Minister Ellison for 33 years, 27 as a partner and 13 as the head of construction, engineering and infrastructure group in Melbourne. And he's assisted on complex projects on a cradle-to-grave basis, designing the procurement strategy, drafting and negotiating the contract, assisting with contract admin and managing the resolution of disputes. and he's one of the founding directors and is a past chair of the Society of Construction Law Australia. He's a past president of the Building Dispute Practitioner Society and a past director of the Australian Construction Industry Forum. Phillip, thank you for coming today and attending this. Harry Nicholas, Principal Hayball. Thank you, Harry, for coming along and generously giving your time. Harry's a principal at Hayball with 30 years of professional experience in the architecture and construction industries. He's an integral member of Hayball's management team and oversees practices quality control, contract risk and professional development activities. And Harry's worked on both sides of the construction contract. His knowledge comes from project managing built work for contractors and from leading architectural teams in the delivery of major projects for private development and state government. Wendy, many people will know Wendy, and I would say if you don't, you probably must be running a squeaky clean practice. So, Wendy, thank you for coming. Your knowledge is always incredibly well received. And Wendy's been a risk manager since 2005, providing plain English advice on consultancy agreements on behalf of planned cover, as well as fantastic training consultants in risk management and creating guidance materials on emerging challenges in the construction industry. So thank you, all three panelists. I think we will kick it off so we can get stuck in. So I believe, Phillip, you're going to lead.
Yes, thank you, Stuart. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to make some comments about Novation. What is Novation all about? And why might have it become relevant to for the Institute to think about preparing its own reference deed of novation? I'm going to share my screen for you. So life starts off with a client architect agreement. And the client architect agreement might be in a variety of forms. You might use an institute style document. You might have a document imposed upon you by the principal and the like. And the client architect agreement will have a bundle of rules in it about the engagement between the client and the architect and what it is the architect has to do. Sometimes those provisions are provisions which work well for architects. Sometimes there can be some troublesome provisions in there, and that's the type of thing which Wendy might comment on when she's providing advice to some of the members of the Institute. In relation to a D&C project, you then have the client entering into a design and construct contract with the D&C contractor. And as the name suggests, that contractor is going to be responsible for the design, usually for the completion of the design, because this happens part way through the design process. The key reason, one of the key advantages a client seeks to achieve out of the D&C contract is single line accountability, so that they can look to the D&C contractor for accountability in relation to both design activity and construction activity. In order for the D&C contractor to be comfortable about providing the client with that single line accountability, the D&C contractor needs to bring the architect onto its team. And the mechanism through which the D&C contractor brings the architect onto its team is through a deed of novation. And in simple terms, what the deed of novation does is it swings the relationship from a client-architect relationship to a D&C contractor-architect relationship. And if you think about the simplest form of deed of novation, what that deed ought to do is merely swing that original client-architect agreement from being an agreement with the client to being an agreement with the D&C contractor. And the consequence of that, there's two important consequences which flow from that. One is, in the theoretical world, there is no residual continuing relationship between the client and the architect. The relationship is now between the D&C contractor and the architect. And the second theoretical point is that the client-architect agreement itself, apart from the change in party from client to D&C contractor, the actual detailed terms of the client-architect agreement ought not alter. There is no reason in terms of the implementation of a simple novation process why the provisions in that original client-architect agreement would need to alter. It is a very rare circumstance that novation is implemented in that simple form. And what most often happens is two things. First of all, the deed of novation typically interferes with the original client-architect agreement. So through the deed of novation, the parties, primarily the D&C contractor, but also the client, seek to adjust some provisions, some important provisions that were in the client-architect agreement originally. And often the adjustment which is sought to be made to those provisions through the deed of novation, they're not ordinarily to the advantage of the architect, they're ordinarily to the advantage of the D&C contractor primarily. And often the adjustment to those provisions can create significant concerns, and often significant concerns from a professional indemnity insurance perspective. The second thing that a typical deed of novation does is it preserves a residual connection between the client and the architect. Now, there are some positive aspects to this residual connection, and Harry will, I think, speak about some of those positive aspects. There are some negative aspects to that residual connection, and those negative aspects typically have to do with the future potential accountability and liability of the architect, and those negative residual aspects can create difficulty again in relation to a professional indemnity insurance perspective. So a typical deed of novation does a lot more than what is needed to be done through the simplest implementation of a deed of novation. And if you look at three different types of deed of novations, which you sometimes see, those of you who might be familiar with the AS 4902 Design and Construct Contract published by Standards Australia, it has a deed of novation as part of the published document. I think it's Annexure Part E or thereabouts. That deed of novation is 1 page long, and indeed much of that 1 page is taken up by describing the parties and the like. So if you looked at what are the legally effective provisions in that deed of novation, they probably occupy less than half an A4 page, and there are 3 clauses. And that's what you might see as the simplest form of vanilla deed of novation. And that deed of novation will achieve the very simple novation that I referred to a few minutes ago. If we go to the right-hand side of this slide, to the other extreme, and look at what a typical expanded deed of novation looks like, and what government has fallen into the habit of using, and what the private sector has fallen into the habit of using, that typical expanded deed of novation is 10 pages long. And that's 10 pages of legal effective clauses compared to the half a page in the AS 4902, and it's got 11 clauses there rather than 3. And indeed, I have seen deeds of novation which perhaps grow to as much as 15 and 20 pages long. And so if you ask yourself, novation can be achieved through half a page of text and 3 clauses, what is happening in 10 pages of text and 11 clauses? And it is that variation to the underlying client-architect agreement, and that creation of the residual relationship is what is happening in relation in those 10 pages and the 11 clauses. The AIA, the Architects Institute deed of novation, is 5 pages long, 9 clauses long, so you can see that it lives partway between those 2 documents. And there's some good reasons why there's some additional provisions in the reference deed of novation. Good reasons in terms of enhancing the rhythm of behaviour that might exist in relation to a D&C contract, good reasons in terms of protecting the architect's position and the like, and Harry will make some comments about some of those provisions. But the Institute's reference deed of novation, as you can see, is in contrast with the typical expanded deed of novation. And part of the objective, I think, and Stuart might comment on this, in releasing this deed of novation is to try and progress the conversation with the marketplace, and to try and have the marketplace rethink its approach to the deed of novation, and try and encourage the marketplace to adopt the deed of novation, which is closer to the 5 pages, 9 clauses, rather than the 10 pages, 11 clauses. Thank you, Stuart. That brings me to the end of my comments.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Philip. And yes, you're right. The only comment I'd quickly make is that sitting in the middle there points to what one might say a sharing of the vision of the project. So where everyone is collaborating and there's a high level of convivial communication between everyone, contractor, developer, project manager and architect. So the shared vision is the objective, and it would seem that the happy medium that you've described there may point toward that. Wendy, did you want to follow on from Philip?
I can. I had thought Harry was next up.
Oh, no. Okay, we'll go for Harry. Go, Harry. Thank you.
Wendy, I'm just tempted to throw it back to you now, but I won't. Thank you, Stuart. Appreciate it, and thank you, Philip, for that very succinct introduction into what is a complex endeavour indeed. I just want to take my turn to share screen. So one moment there, please. Just want to talk a little bit about the role, I guess my contribution really to this team, and I've had the pleasure of having brought the experience that I've had on both sides of the construction contract into the discussion. I've looked at this as a sample user, I guess. I'm kind of like the token representative of our respective points of view. And what I've tried to do is really avoid the legal and insurance side of the discussion, to which Philip and Wendy can talk more than capably, because I'm not really legally trained. I'm looking at it from a practicality standpoint, from a perspective of one who would be at the forefront of managing the relationships through the core scope of services that the architect would undertake under the client, and then through the transition in the Novation procurement model. So I just want to talk a little bit about how this model deed improves the settings for Novation, and how we might think about its implementation through the process. And what I'd like to really question in the first instance is the empowerment of the architect as custodian of quality. How does the architect remain present? And how do they maintain transparency, client face, open lines of communication? And how are they empowered to protect their tenure of engagement and fulfill their obligations to their stakeholders? I don't think that the architect is the only custodian of quality, but it could be argued that we certainly are expected through our scope of services in the way that our consultancy agreements are sometimes written, especially when we're acting as lead design consultant or principal design consultant, depending on the terms within the contract. I think certainly see ourselves as the primary custodian of design quality through the process. And the model deed accomplishes these in a number of ways. It has a series of mechanisms which interweave, interrelate, and act as a whole to assist the architect in maintaining, in the first instance, a robust line of communication with the client, with the express purpose of protecting design quality and empowering the architect to continue servicing. Clauses 5.2 and 5.4 in the deed, you will see these once you've downloaded a copy, offer such mechanisms. And 5.2 reads that the consultant may advise the principal if the consultant forms a view that the works may not comply with the works contract. So often it is seen in novation deeds that line of communication that we had originally with the client is disrupted, or rather has to go through the contractor. This deed makes it expressly clear that the consultant reserves the right to communicate. And then in turn, under clause 5.4, the principal may make reasonable inquiries of the consultant for the purpose of considering whether the design and the works are in accordance with the works contract. So it's really about looking at maintaining that line of communication so as to control deviations. And further, there are other clauses that assist the architect in maintaining an openness and a sense of transparency in reporting to the client, not feeling inhibited by the fact that their tenure now lies under novation to the contractor, directly to the contractor. In the first instance, clause 5.2a obliges the contractor to provide to the principal copies of all reports, and these reports must be provided without amendment or omission. And that means that the architect retains confidence that the manner in which they report and the contents of their reports remain whole and unedited. Further, clause 5.2c1 allows the consultant to provide a copy of any report or certificate which is the subject of paragraph 5.2a directly to the principal. So if there's a need for the consultant to feel that they should report directly, they're empowered and indeed expressly permitted to do so. Supporting the architect's obligations in advising on design changes and material substitutions. Now, this is a real issue in many cases where substitutions are made which are not in the interests of the project. They're not in the interests of the principal, and they're not in keeping with the design intent. And in some cases, they're made without the consultant having had a right of recourse. So clauses 5.1b, 1 and 2 address that. So in completing the design of the works, the contractor is not permitted to substitute products. And further, under subclause 2, the consultant is not obliged to and is not permitted to give effect to any direction or instruction from the contractor, where doing so would result in a breach of 5.1b1, and that being that the works are not in accordance with a works contract. Both those clauses work together, quite an important shift in empowerment. Moving on to further obligations to the contractor under this deed to involve and empower the architect in carrying out their design and quality of service obligations. And these are just sample sentences from various clauses, 5.5, 6.1 and 6.2, which are preceded by the contractor must. The first one addresses allowing the consultant to access the site, and extended wording in that clause talks about to the extent that the consultant requires access so as to conduct their obligations. Clause 6.1 talks about facilitating the participation of the consultant in value management process, and how often is the case that the architect is not privy to the fluctuations of the construction budget or the construction cost, and therefore are not made present during value management meetings, and design decisions are made on content and scope, and the architect is informed after the fact. Here the consultant, the architect specifically, is brought into that process through the obligations of the contractor. And furthermore, clause 6.2 talks about that the works are to be programmed so that there is sufficient time for the consultant to diligently discharge their obligations and responsibilities. In that we shouldn't be pressured under the threat of time, threat of program, that the contractor should plan ahead and allow the consultant the time required to do the thinking and to do the work. Moving forward, certain clauses actually work to better protect the architect's tenure at client phase and to mitigate the risk of termination of services for the contractor's convenience. So that clause 7.1 brings the consultant into PCG meetings or similar meetings or similar mechanisms within consortium communication, and that the contractor is obligated to facilitate such participation, so that we are not kept at arm's length when decisions are made that impact on scope and design quality. That's under clause 7.1b. And then clause 3a2 states that the contractor and the consultant are not permitted to assert that the novated contract or this deed of novation has been terminated or varied without the consent of the principal. Now, this is a very good little mechanism that means that we can't be terminated for the contractor's convenience. We can't be told to stop, that our services will be carried out by others. And there are instances where that is an entirely valid move within the context of a project, depending on the circumstances. But that cannot happen here without the consent of the principal. So this particular wording forces communication between the parties and facilitates transparency in that exchange, should such circumstances be warranted, greatly to our favour. So this really raises a question as to who benefits from such terms in the pursuit of quality, as in how do we communicate the benefits? And in the first instance, the benefits can only be described in terms of success, and defining success for each of the parties in the consortium is important. That risk profile, the commercial insurance and design quality risk profile, is intrinsically related to the definition of success. As example might be where a client or a stakeholder group is seeking quality outcomes, design quality outcomes, a contractor may in fact be seeking highest possible margin. Those two don't always align, and the architect may be left in the middle, trying to express the needs of a client they have come to know and appreciate, with a vision that is ideally shared. And you'll see that under managing relationships, transparent communication and empowerment of the architect in communicating that vision and making clear the intent under which the services are being delivered is a key driver in achieving project success. Ultimately, the mechanisms of this deed really serve well to bring the architect to the fore, where under many circumstances, many different novation examples we could commonly cite, that is not the case. The game here is to have the consultant, the architect, remain present for the duration of their tenure on the project, and that is to practical completion, to defects liability period, post-occupancy evaluation and beyond. That's it for me, Stuart. Thank you for your time. I'll stop sharing.
Fantastic, Harry. Really appreciate that. It was very clear and great explanation of those key clauses, actually, because you can see where it's actually putting scaffolding around our role within that process. Really important. But again, you know, your last clauses there on your very last slide talking about, you know, ultimately it's the client's project. And so this process hopefully not only empowers the client, but empowers a fantastic outcome for the client through what I said earlier in terms of a shared vision. So, yeah, thank you. Now over to Wendy. We've got a couple of questions coming through, but we'll look at those after this. But take it away, Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm starting by taking a step back and talking about, generally speaking, why does novation matter to insurers and why is this new novation deed potentially a benefit? If I could see all of your faces, I'm sure I would know a huge number of you, but since I don't know who's watching, I just want to recap who we are and how we fit into the industry. The name you're most likely to know is Plan Cover. They are the professional indemnity insurance broker that is owned by the Institute of Architects. They are not technically the insurer, but they place insurance for a very large portion of the architects in Australia. Our team at Informed by Plan Cover are a group of legally qualified risk managers who provide some add-on services that are available to those who place their insurance through Planned. I just wanted to mention we also have a new law practice that we started a few years ago, but I'm mentioning that mostly to highlight the fact that Informed Lawyers is not the capacity in which I'm talking to you today. I'm very much confining myself to the insurance issues. And in that general ballpark, I wanted to talk about our contract review service because one of the kinds of contracts that we review is novation deeds. So at the moment, we review well over 1,000 contracts every year. Many of you will be familiar with those reviews. Our reviews through the Planned Cover program are confined to issues directly relevant to professional indemnity insurance. The contracts that we review are greatly skewed towards the contracts of government and commercial, and that includes institutional, like schools, for example. The reason for that, I would say, is those of you who are working on almost solely domestic projects are not being given a client-drafted consultancy agreement. You guys are using the Institute of Architects client-architect agreement or your own terms and conditions. And although you're welcome to use our review service, you have much less need to do it than those of you who are confronted regularly with client-drafted consultancy agreements of 50 to 100 pages. So with that limitation of what our review service tends to cover, I looked at what we've seen in terms of novation. Because we look at so many contracts, we probably have a window on the construction industry that few others would have. So looking back at the contracts that we've reviewed since 2019, we're looking at what percentage of them have included a provision for novation. And this doesn't tell you whether that provision was used. As you know, sometimes your clients put novation in the contract, but reserve the right to decide and tell you later whether or not they're actually going to use that. We review at the start of the project, so all we know is what the contract included. And you'll see the percentage of contracts that we see that provide for novation tends to vary between something like 30% and close to 50%, depending on the year. Those fluctuations from year to year, I don't think they represent sort of changes in industry thinking. It's not as if for some reason novation got suddenly unpopular in 2021 to explain that dip. It's simply the random range of contracts that happen to come across our desks. I would say anecdotally, I think the use of novation is gradually increasing, but not on a very steep incline. It's interesting if you break it down by the state of the office that sent us the contract for review. You'll see the highest bar there at 48% is Victoria. And it is, as far as we can see, far more common for contracts in Victoria to provide for novation. Queensland has got the second highest percentage there at 37%. This is based on just this year's statistic. To be honest, as a long-term trend, I think it's probably not quite that high. It is common in Queensland, but probably not more common than New South Wales. You can see New South Wales is sitting there at 32%. South Australia, almost 30%. And I think if you'd asked 10 years ago, that percentage would have been a lot lower. But those of you who are based in Adelaide will be aware, state government in South Australia has, over the last few years, pushed into procuring by novation, for better or for worse. Western Australia, you'll see, has a considerably lower use of novation. I've taken Tasmania out of the statistics because I'm convinced that this year's statistic is an aberration. Tasmania came out at something like 60 to 70% novation. I think that's purely because of the swathe of contracts that we happen to be sent from Tasmania. I'm confident that it is not a common form of procurement, except again with a small selection of state government projects. What is, I think, much more instructive, and this is the last of the charts I'm going to show you, is when we break it down by the type of project. We don't have a very sophisticated breakdown of project type, but these are some of the categories that we use. Perhaps surprisingly, the sector that recorded the highest use of novation was university clients, followed, as you can see, by state government clients, and that was almost 60% for university and over 40% for state government. The third bar that you can see is commercial, which is our category. It includes property developers, it includes healthcare, it includes anything that doesn't fit in the other categories. What's interesting about that is, again, traditionally and historically, it was property developers who were the key users of novation because their priority is cost and time, and they perceive novation as creating greater certainty over those things, although I'm not aware of any research that actually measures whether that's true. The thinking, well, I'm surprised that it has changed so much over the last 10 years that, in fact, we're seeing universities and government increasingly use novation. The reason I'm surprised by that is I would have thought those kind of clients are long-term owner-occupiers of the building that is being built and should have a much greater interest in the briefing process and in maintaining a close connection with their design team so that they can keep tailoring the design as the project progresses. I would have thought those are also clients who care more about the third arm of the triangle, which is long-term quality, and don't want to lose control of that. So that's why I'm surprised at this shift, but the shift is undeniable, and anecdotally I agree that this kind of shift is taking place. So moving across, 33% of federal and other government projects used novation or provided for novation, and at a local government level, the level was much smaller. At a domestic level, the percentage is approximately 0, according to our limited view on the construction industry. Is novation covered by professional indemnity insurance? The main policy that plan cover place for architects has got a specific clause that says, yes, it's covered. The two sub-clauses are kind of carve-outs from that cover. It provides that liabilities in novation wouldn't be covered in the novation deed if they also wouldn't have been covered in the original client-architect agreement. So unqualified warranties of fitness for purpose, broad indemnity clauses, that kind of thing are not being covered in novation deeds any more than they're covered in consultancy agreements. And the second exclusion is additional or duplicated liability. That is where the architect has got a full set of contractual responsibilities to their original client, the principal, but then they also take on a completely duplicated set of liabilities to the builder. That is not how novation is supposed to work, and that duplication is specifically excluded from insurance cover. Other policies, some mention novation, but a lot of policies that are out there don't mention it as a yes, it's covered, or as a no, it's not covered. So there's a level of uncertainty, and you have to fall back on interpreting the general policy provisions to work out what the insurer's intention might be. But the bit that's really critical today is common insurance risks in novation deeds. There's three main ones that I want to talk about. And the first, and again, those of you who've sent novation deeds drafted by your clients to our contract review service will be well aware of these common issues. The first is that for novation to take place, a new set of liabilities to the builder have to be created. The immediate toolkit of any contract lawyer is always to put warranties and indemnities in contracts. There's no, well, as far as I'm concerned, there's no legal justification that says a contract has to contain those things. They're just things that you as lawyers are used to seeing. When clients use that terminology to create your post-novation obligations, they are creating a risk that your insurer might not be fully covering those obligations. Warranties and broad indemnities are commonly known by insurers to be things that may fall outside the cover of the insurance that they offer. Good news, the new model novation deed does not include warranties or indemnities by the architect. I've already touched on this problem of duplicated liability. That is where you're not released from your original liability to the principal, but you are taking on a new set of obligations to the builder. Again, there's a good release in the model novation deed. It doesn't give you duplicated liabilities to two clients at the same time. And we also sometimes see broad releases where you are expected to release the principal from an extremely broad range of claims, including potentially their own negligence. Again, that the deed doesn't contain those kind of releases. So as compared to a typical client drafted deed of novation, it is, from an insurance point of view, a very considerable improvement. What does that mean for the future? What I hope it means is a gradual improvement in the culture of writing novation deeds. Up till now, those of you working in the space that uses novation deeds would have seen an awful lot of client-drafted, client-centered novation deeds, and you and your clients probably wouldn't have seen an alternative novation deed that works from the consultant's point of view because there wasn't a template that exists. There now is one. So that, I think, can have an effect on culture overall. I also think some of the clauses that Harry had on screen before, for example, those little protections like the obligation to involve you in some key decision-making after novation, even if you can't use the whole deed, each individual clause might give you ideas for the sorts of things that you could add to your client-drafted novation deeds. Another thing that I think is handy, and this is my last slide, just so you can all pace yourself for asking and answering questions. One thing I found in contract negotiations is sometimes the principal, let's say, for example, they're a state government, as they often are, in their consultancy agreement, they will give themselves what are sometimes called master-slave powers. That is very broad, almost unfettered ability to give you directions, for example, or to set off claimed amounts against your fees. And when you ask for those clauses to be changed, the client says, but we're government. You can trust us to exercise those unfettered powers reasonably, so we don't need to amend the contract. I have found you can sometimes make headway with those clients by explaining to them, yes, we trust you, but this whole contract, including the master-slave powers, are going to be novated to a builder. We don't even know who that builder is at this point. How can you ask us to trust them with the same unfettered powers? Sometimes some clients will agree, as long as they're the client, they won't amend the contract, but from the point of novation onwards, they will agree to it being amended. So one feature of the model deed is, I think it's clause 2.2D, is where you can specify, here are some clauses from the original client architect agreement that are deemed to be deleted at the point of novation. So that's another effective negotiation strategy that you have. And I think the last benefit of the deed, and again, this is not direct, this is more of an indirect cultural change benefit. As you know, we've had a lot of problems over the last 10 years with construction quality and use of non-conforming products. A lot of that has been concentrated in the multi-residential space. I don't know I could ever show that novation itself has contributed to that as a direct cause, but in terms of sidelining architects and other consultants and siloing other consultants from each other, I think it does play a behind-the-scenes contributing role in that. For example, in both the La Crosse building and Grenfell Tower fires, siloing of the fire engineer in particular from other consultants really does appear to be a contributing factor. So a lot of those clauses that Harry mentioned about continuing involvement of consultants in the project hopefully can somewhat reverse that trend over the last decade or so and create better environments to work on projects. That's all I have to say. I'm just going to click over to the most important slide, which is the disclaimer, and hand back to you, Stuart, for the Q&A.
Thank you, Wendy. That's wonderful. Really interesting. There's a few quite interesting comments and questions coming up. I might just read a couple of those out actually and invite some discussion. But I did pick up on your very interesting comment, I thought, about the general overarching objective for doing this in the first place is the perceived saving of cost and time, but actually there's probably very little, if no, evidence or research done on whether that is actually the case. Paul, I don't know whether you want to comment on that, but that could be a fantastic initiative to actually try and find out and get data on whether or not it's actually achieving what people think it's meant to be achieving.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes. So I've just been answering a question about the availability, so I should have it up there this afternoon. What I will put up on the website is the policy@architecture.com.au email address until we get an electronic form that prompts you to provide your at least your email details and your name when you download. What we want to do is follow up everyone who seeks to use the deed, and in 2024 we should do a survey. I think we probably need to allow at least 6 months for people to use the deed and start to experience its impacts. I think the early impact that I would like to test is just simply the degree to which this deed gets used without amendment or redacting of any of the clauses that we've got in there that Harry stepped us through so wonderfully, that really start to push the envelope on the novation process. And so that in the first instance, at that very initial impact level, has the market accepted this deed in a fairly unaltered form or an unredacted form? And then secondly, to get some further outcome or effect evaluation around how did this change the nature of a novated design and construct project compared to your previous experience. We only have to look at what has been said in the original novation research to understand the degree to which architects have really experienced novated design and construct in a very negative way. They also recognise some strengths of this procurement method, but we got we received very loud signals about what is perceived as highly challenging, highly problematic, and in fact highly conducive to risk in such a way that it ultimately creates risk for the principal, for the long-term asset holder, and diminishes building quality. And this is part of an institute effort to improve building quality in this country by getting procurement processes right. So that's the longer answer to the question, Stuart. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Fantastic. Yeah, I think it really does point to the need for just testing at this stage and seeing, getting as much data as we possibly can. I just want to sort of pick up, Phillip, you provided an interesting response to Phil Chadwick's. Phil Chadwick, thanks for your couple of comments there, Phil. But Phil put up one saying that these clauses are excellent to avoid risk of materials being used that could fundamentally compromise the future of the building. However, imagine it places the architect with a dilemma and raises the risk of conflict with the contractor. And of course, that's the thing that we're all thinking about here, is that how is this going to be received? And Phillip, you've put there that the issue of the relationship management, very key term here, relationship management, and the potential for the continuing involvement provisions place stress on the relationship. So I'm just interested, Phillip, in your comments. You did respond there with that, and just on how key, the skill of the architect in this instance in being the leaven for the bread throughout the process.
Well, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, what is it that the architect brings to this process? And there's really three things the architect brings to this process, it seems to me. One is creative vision. The other is technical competence in terms of how it describes that creative vision in the architectural documents. And then the third is relationship management. And each of those is absolutely critical to the successful delivery of the project, particularly in the post-novation era. And that management of the relationship is perhaps the most important thing in the post-novation era, because if the architect is not able to navigate the complexity that can arise when it's making use of these continuing involvement provisions, and how does that complexity arise? I mean, fundamentally, there's a conflict of interest here between the principal and the D&C contractor, and the conflict of interest is that the D&C contractor is not particularly interested in quality. Of course, they're interested in building the building to a sufficient standard to avoid liability and to avoid the circumstances where their reputation might be damaged in an unfortunate way. But beyond that, the D&C contractor might not be particularly interested in quality, but has a very keen interest in driving down the price. And the owner may be interested in quality, depending upon whether the owner is a long-term holder of the asset or whether the owner is turning over the asset very quickly. And you've got the architect there who has a very, very keen interest in both the technical quality and a very, very keen interest in the aesthetic, the architectural integrity of it. I mean, there's a degree of emotional pride, I'm sure, which architects have in what they have designed. And they've got their own selfish ego involvement in terms of what they've designed and wanting to preserve that. And that gives rise to potentially very significant tension. And it takes great skill on the part of the architect how to make use of those continuing involvement provisions in a way which minimises the damage to the relationship. And I won't for a moment suggest that that is easy. That requires skill and experience, and it's a real challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Phillip. I mean, absolutely. I think it's just critical communication and the ability to communicate effectively, because ultimately you also want your client walking away. You don't want them sitting around at a dinner party saying, "Oh, we used so-and-so and it was a debacle." So that's the other aspect of it. So it's often I feel that as practitioners, we're sort of the rubber band between all of that. Another one I just want to pick up on is the interesting comment. Can you provide the pros and cons of convincing a client to novate the project at a later phase, for example, at 70% CD instead of 50% DD? I know of a project where an architect successfully convinced the client to novate the architect at almost 100% contract documentation to maintain quality. You've made a comment there, Philip, about the disadvantage of principal, no doubt. Harry, you may want to comment on this as well. The disadvantage of principal, no doubt, encounter in relation to 100% novation is the lack of enthusiasm of the contractor.
Happy to comment a little on this. Stuart, Philip, did you want to
well, perhaps
put some
just
further commentary to yours?
Clarify. I mean, the D&C contractor, what I hear from D&C contractors is that they generally grumble about novation taking place too late in the day. I mean, I don't know at what percentage point you might say. I've had in my mind that, you know, it typically takes place, I'm going to say at 66% documentation or whatever it might be. And D&C contractors grumble about that because the great advantage which D&C contractors see in a D&C contract is the freedom they have to fiddle with the design. And the more advanced the design is, then the less freedom they have. And it's through that freedom that they seek to enhance or preserve their profit. So I think the D&C contractor marketplace will be completely unenthusiastic about novation at 100% or near 100%. And for most principals, I mean, if you've got an informed, robust, sophisticated principal, they may well be able to engage in a equal strength discussion with a D&C contractor on this issue, but most principals are not able to engage in an equal strength discussion with the D&C contractor, and it'll be the D&C contractor which usually reigns supreme in this discussion. And one way in which you see that being borne out is if you have a deed of novation in the client consultant agreement, which you might be happy with, but when the client then engages the D&C contractor, the D&C contractor then says, oh no, but I don't like that deed of novation. You've got to use my deed of novation because it's a, you know, it's a more advantageous deed for the D&C contractor. And typically the D&C contractor will win that discussion because they have the greater strength at that point in time. So I think that's the real challenge in terms of novation at or near 100%.
I don't disagree with novation at 100% being unlikely, but what we've heard is architects sometimes being novated on what is barely schematic design. So we are well in advance of even 50%. And that I would have thought the big risks there are, one, the builder's price will not be a good price because they haven't got enough detail. And architects have told me builders actually really hate having to bid on very incomplete designs because there's so much uncertainty they have to price in. And I think you would also be saying to your client, the principal, why are you paying designers? And you're paying them one way or another. You're either paying them directly or paying them through the builder after novation. Why are you paying for this professional advice if you're going to novate very early and actually allow the builder to do the design? Why are you paying a builder who's not qualified to do the design to do the design?
I was going to pretty much throw to you then, Wendy, and ask about that risk, you know, the risk graph, if you like, of novating. The earlier you novate, the greater the risk to the architect, essentially, I would have thought.
So I think we're all trying to find that perfect medium point. And I think, Philip, you touched on about something like 66%, 70% seems to be the ballpark where you get the best of both worlds.
Okay.
Can I add a couple of things to this? So in the first instance, we need to understand what does 70% CD versus 50% DD actually mean to the various parties. So what does that mean to the architect? How many of the details are they willing to leave out? Are the slab layout plans going to be left out of the scope of works altogether at that point? Will they be developed in conjunction with a contractor? What does that actually mean to the contractor? Even if we say 70% CD, which is coming back to that question, even if we say 70% CD, what do we mean by that? Is what we call CD, is that they're issued for construction documentation? So is that their IFC? Is it their DD? Because for them, design development is continuing while value management may be developing, may be continuing. So I think defining our terms and understanding what it is that the contractor actually requires for effective D&C in the first instance. I completely empathize with the intent to novate at 100% complete CD when the documents are done and they're finished and the design risk has been taken out of it from our point of view. Philip, you talked about single line accountability. I guess that's one of the pros for the client or the principal, where they're implementing D&C, at least for one phase, the construction phase, they maintain single line accountability. And yet the contractor is almost left in the middle in that they've got full accountability, but they have very little control over design without variation. So it could be said that they come to the party and they ask, well, if I did receive the design at 100% complete and I've got no redesign within my disposal, then if something doesn't work in the documentation, if availability on certain products or materials isn't what it used to be, and it isn't there because of the amount of time that's passed between tender and engagement, then I do have a valid variation, and perhaps the consultant is involved in attending to that variation, whether it be as a commercial beneficiary or a design curation participant. So there is risk in going to 100% CD, even though I can empathise with the intent, and the intent could happen in an instance where D&C was not originally contemplated, and the architect conducted their services as if they were proceeding towards a traditional procurement. And then bringing it in 100% CD for a larger project especially could, in some instances, be promoted by certain project managers and client groups and stakeholders. So understand that.
It depends on their attitude, I guess, to their objectives. We've got one more question, then I will need to wind the session up. In fact, we could keep going all afternoon. But Wendy, just in terms of what does it actually mean at a certain percentage? I mean, perhaps there's an opportunity there to define that as practically as possible at that time in the original in the agreement in some way, in an addendum to the agreement, saying this is when it's going to be novated, and this means the deliverables are as follows.
There's a risk and benefit there. I mean, yes, it's good to have definition, but as one of the questions has raised, we recommend that people don't write in novation deeds something like, at the point of novation, our documents will be 70% complete.
Yeah.
Because years ago, we did have a claim from a D&C contractor saying, well, it wasn't 70, it was only 65%. And these are not things that you can easily measure.
Okay.
So best to address it in general terms, in the sense of design development will be substantially complete before novation, for example. There's risks in, and I think, Harry, you've also touched on how hard it is to actually define what 70% completion means.
Yeah.
So,
great. Thank you, Wendy. That's excellent. Lastly, Andrew Richardson, thank you, Andrew, has put through a comment. With this continuing involvement comes time and cost. These provisions require convincing the stakeholders that this extra involvement is ultimately worth it. Does anyone want to, just Harry, do you want to sort of make a comment, or Phillip maybe, or Wendy?
Do you mean, I'm guessing the question means the architect being more involved during construction phase.
Yeah.
What I take out of the Lacrosse judgment is, unless your contract is written by your lawyers and very robust, you are always exposed to the risks that arise during construction phase, as long as you're working on the project, particularly, for example, product substitution. And I think you are much better off to embrace that risk, tackle it head on, and have as much control and input as you can have, rather than thinking, oh, so long as I don't put my hands in it, I won't get claims. Unfortunately, if your title is architect, at some point someone is always going to turn around and say you are one of the parties who should have picked up that problem. I wish it wasn't, but it is.
And is it fair to say, Wendy, that that's especially true when the terms such as lead design consultant or principal design consultant are in the contract and then covered under the scope of services, responsible for managing, coordinating sub-consultants or secondary consultants? Vicarious liability risk then ties in.
And can I say, Harry, those kind of clauses and that kind of phrasing that you've mentioned, I am seeing now far more often in client consultant agreements, and I think it does introduce a very subtle change to the potential risk profile for the architect.
Yeah,
a subtle but powerful change.
There was a time, I recall, when you could get away with simply stating that we're only reviewing on the purposes of general design intent, general aesthetic design intent. I don't think I think that's a risky proposition.
No. And I think that those clauses generally, and I don't know whether Wendy's got a view on this, I think they generally, you generally need some constraining words inserted into those clauses so that the obligations of the architect under that clause is confined to those professional areas of professional activity for the architect.
Agreed.
Yeah. I think you'd need very strong wording to be able to limit your liability to just aesthetic qualities. And I really think that's just a fallback if you can't negotiate anything else. The better solution is always be involved and influence good outcomes so you stay out of court. And the other part of that that's out of scope for today is you need to be paid for that work. Everyone needs to recognise that novation doesn't require less work. It might require more work, and that architects can only do the work if they're getting paid for their time.
How true. Thank you, Wendy. Look, just like very lastly, Phil Chadwick's just made an interesting point. The provisions of early contractor involvement for DD help in a two-stage tender process and is a better alternative to novation. We'll make that the last comment if anyone wants to just comment on that, and then I'll.
Well, I mean, ECI process may well be a better alternative than novation, but it's a question of you do need either a very healthy relationship between the principal and the contractor, and one where they're virtually of the one mind, or you need a very sophisticated principal who is prepared to maintain strong involvement in the process in order for an ECI arrangement to bring value, I think. Yeah,
I'd agree with that, Philip, on that. I think that does rely heavily on devotion to the project by all parties. Yeah. Okay, well, look, I think we will wrap it up there, Paul. What a fantastic hour and 10 minutes we've had. And thank you, Philip, Wendy, Harry. Just really fabulous insights. Great questions as well, too. Thank you from everyone. This is obviously going to be an ongoing dialogue, I think, and it's just fantastic, Paul. Thank you to the team and everyone who's been involved in getting this document together and getting it up. Now is the time for testing. So what I would say, I put my National President's hat on my head, is to say, please, in every opportunity where you see it's relevant, try, where you're being asked or the process is toward novation, try and put this contract in front of people's noses and then test it out and see if we can get it through and get the data and the feedback. I'm sure you'd agree with that, Paul.
Yes. No, thank you, Stuart. And I'd just like to say again, thank you to Fender Katslidis for their strong patronage of this work, to Philip for his absolute brilliant mind in creating this deed, to the peer reviewing of Harry and Wendy in particular, and to yourself today, Stuart, for coming in as National President to give, I suppose, your leadership messaging around the importance of this deed and the project overall. So I thank you really all for everything that has happened.
No, it's great. Thank you, Paul. It's only going to be as good as, the more it's used and the more it's tested, the better this is going to be in the longer term.
Okay.
All right. Well, look, on that note, I think we'll just all say goodbye. Thank you, Philip, Wendy, Harry, Paul, everyone, FK, of course, and thank you to everyone who's attended. I hope we get some great feedback.
Okay. Bye.
See you then.
Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.